So Judge Rakoff started this session by talking about the rather considerable lack of controversy. So let me at least suggest one area in which there might be some. I want to talk a little bit, somewhat more specifically, about the question of the use of neuroscience in lie detection and related areas, an area in which there is a little bit more controversy. So just to give a little background of the controversy, there are a number of people, perhaps most prominently Hank Greeley, as well as a number of neuroscientists, Nancy Kanwisher, perhaps most prominently, and some number of others, who have been evaluating the possibility that neuroscience can be used in lie detection. They have, at least on the existing state of the research, concluded that on that research there are sufficient shortfalls of reliability, sufficient shortfalls of validity, such that the current techniques are not even close enough to being usable. So let me offer what might be a slightly, but only slightly, so maybe less controversy than you might think, a different cut on this issue. So I am going to talk about the legal dimensions of neuroscience and lie detection, but the message is not just about lie detection. The larger message, of which the controversy about neuroscience and veracity is one example. The larger message is that the use of neuroscience in law, or the use of science generally, is not only a scientific question, but is also, and perhaps ultimately, a legal question as well. And I want to talk a little bit about what flows from that. So, let me revert then to neuroscience and lie detection more particularly. Let me start with a hypothetical but somewhat concrete example. So suppose we have a criminal prosecution for, say, carjacking. Both the victim and another witness are white. They both identify the same African-American man as the carjacker. He claims mistaken identity. He claims he was home in bed and just happens to look like somebody that carjacked their car. Both of the prosecution witnesses testify, both the victim and another witness. Then the defendant voluntarily decides to testify in his own behalf. Turns out he has a criminal record that comes out on cross-examination, as it typically would. And then the question arises, under these circumstances, would we or should we or might we in the future allow this defendant to present in his own defense a neuroscientific examination of himself indicating that his claim to have been somewhere else is true? Now, there is no doubt, and here there is an area of agreement, that on the current state of neuroscience, there is no way that a neuroscientific examination of someone can satisfy the proof beyond the reasonable doubt standard that a prosecution would need in order to put somebody in prison. But of course, the defendant does not have to show that in order to get off, in order to be acquitted, the evidence of his innocence has to be proved beyond the reasonable doubt. Indeed, the amount of evidence necessary for a defendant to rebut a claim that he has been proved guilty beyond the reasonable doubt is obviously far, far, far less than proof beyond the reasonable doubt. So then the question that emerges from this, if, as the example was designed to suggest, that evidence that might be far too weak to support a conviction might nevertheless be plausibly usable by a defendant whose burdens are quite different, does that suggest that there might be certain circumstances in which evidence that admittedly, and here again we agree, admittedly does not come to current standards of scientific reliability or validity, might nevertheless be plausibly usable in the criminal justice system? And I use the criminal justice system just as an example. There are numerous other uses, whether it be in civil law or other parts of the criminal justice system. Under what circumstances might we be interested in using the techniques of neuroscience to determine whether a police officer testifying at a suppression hearing regarding illegally obtained evidence might or might not be telling the truth? Now, what I mean by all of this is to suggest the possibility that evidence that might be insufficient as a matter of science might nevertheless in some contexts be sufficient as a matter of law, or as I somewhat bluntly overstated it in the title of an article, can bad science be good evidence? So the common worry about this claim is that juries will not understand what they are seeing, especially in the neuroscience context. Juries, and maybe even some judges, although certainly not any of the ones that are here, juries will see a brain scan. They will think, oh, it is lighting up under certain circumstances and not lighting up under other circumstances. Juries understand lighting up, even though that's not an accurate or even close to an accurate description of what happens, but they see the picture. They think it's lighting up under some circumstances and not another. And they will immediately be persuaded by all of this. In other words, that they will be substantially over-persuaded because of the nature of neuroscientific evidence beyond what the intrinsic reliability of the evidence would indicate. And, of course, there is evidence that juries will overvalue brain scan evidence. But there is also evidence that juries will overvalue pictures, that they will overvalue charts, that they will overvalue physical objects, and that they will overvalue the arguments made by silver-tongued white male lawyers with nice suits. So the real question is a comparative question of compared to what? There is certainly overvaluation here, but indeed some recent research by Michael Sachs and Nick Schweitzer of the Arizona State University have suggested that insofar as there is overvaluation, it is not more overvaluation that we would see by juries than a number of other things. Moreover, in the area of lie detection, what we now know is that juries that are as a matter of law announced to be the primary lie detectors in the courtroom will typically rely on a range of old wives' tales, urban legends, scientific falsities, and the like. People who perspire are more likely to be lying. People who don't look at the jury are more likely to be lying. People who blink a lot are more likely to be lying. Very little of this has any scientific basis. Indeed, when the psychologist Bella DePaulo did various studies on lie detection abilities of ordinary people, the conclusion is that at best they do slightly better than random. That dramatically oversimplifies her research, but at least it suggests that once again the compared to what question cannot be avoided. I should mention that much that I say is at least premised on the notion that not only reliability, but also validity are variable. That is, it is common for scientists to assert, even though many of them know better, it is common for scientists to assert that questions of validity, although not questions of reliability, are susceptible of much more yes or no, on or off, sufficient or insufficient kind of determinations. Validity is also a variable, and implicit in what I am saying is that when we appropriately ask questions about the reliability of a method, or when we appropriately ask questions about the validity of the experiments and the research that have supported it, We ask about what is the support or what is the level of reliability and validity. Scientists can and should tell the legal system what levels of reliability there are, what kind of validity there is, but whether some degree of reliability or some degree of validity is or is not usable in the legal system is, in the final analysis, a legal question and not a scientific question. So, I'm not here to offer a brief for admitting neuroscientific evidence of lie detection. Indeed, if I were a judge today, there's a good possibility that I would not admit it, either on behalf of a prosecution or on behalf of the defense. Rather, I'm here to make a suggestion that the question cannot avoid thinking about the nature of the legal use. It's not just the question, as many of the neuroscientists who've written about this seem to assume. It is not just the question of what can we use to put somebody in jail. So Kanwisher, for example, said that the stakes in the real world are putting someone in prison or life in prison. That's true, but there are stakes in the other direction, and there are stakes in other kinds of contexts. So again, I'll finish just by repeating that as we think about all that we have appropriately learned about neuroscience in general and its various different legal uses, not just in terms of lie detection, and as we think about the even greater uses we might see in the future, we need to be attentive to the questions of compared to what, in what context will they be used, and perhaps most importantly, what are the legal goals in using or excluding that may not be the same as the scientific goals that scientists properly use for their own activities. Thank you.
So that may